In this video, I'll discuss the unique opening movement of Gustav Mahler's First Symphony. This is a personal one for me, since this was the first music I ever became enamored with as a 7-year-old child, sparking my now decades-long classical music obsession. I have a vivid memory of being immediately captivated by its mysterious atmospheric opening, featuring bird calls and distant trumpet fanfares. This singular soundscape and the rest of the symphony transported my 7-year-old imagination to a fantastical world full of knights in shining armor, menacing dragons, and spectacular natural scenery, though these probably weren't the exact images Mahler intended to evoke. The symphony begins with the now iconic sound of the entire string section sustaining this A in 7 different octaves, with most of them playing harmonics. This is a string technique that produces a completely different tone quality by lightly touching the string instead of pinning it down to the fingerboard. This ethereal sound accompanies these eerily scored descending fourths from the woodwinds, and then this chain of descending fourths, except for this last note, answered by a fanfare that I'm calling fanfare number 1, played by the clarinets. The score directs that all of this should be played like the sound of nature, and this important configuration of falling fourths in this symphony is sometimes referred to as the nature motif. If this is your first time hearing this opening, you might share some of the childlike wonder I felt when I heard it decades ago. I owe this pivotal moment of my life to my older brother, who at that time was 16 years old and had been interested in classical music for some time. He had recently purchased this portable CD player, cutting-edge technology back then, with these flimsy headphones that he placed over my ears on that fateful day, and played one of the first CDs in his collection. This recording of Mahler's First Symphony played by the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Because associative memory is such a strange phenomenon, even decades later when I hear these opening bars, I can almost still feel the foam from these headphones pressing against my ears. I refused to listen to anything else for at least many months, and even when I was finally convinced to try out some other music, Mahler's First Symphony remained the soundtrack of my entire childhood. Around 7 years after this, my brother gifted me this Dover score of Symphonies 1 and 2, and I spent so much time studying it as a teen that many years later, while watching the Amazon original series Mozart in the Jungle, I immediately recognized it on the music stand in this scene, just from its sky blue color and this tiny sliver of Mahler's hair. Returning to this remarkable opening, it's interesting that the brilliant orchestration of this first page that we all know and love was one of numerous alterations made by Mahler after this symphony's premiere in 1889. In the original score, the strings played no harmonics, and Mahler realized it wasn't the precise sound he was looking for. In one of his ever-morphing program notes for this symphony, he described this introduction as the awakening of nature in the forest in the earliest morning. And I've always thought these long static notes perfectly capture the stillness of the night, and the expansive 7-octave spread reminds me of the vastness of the night sky. I I don't think I'm alone in this interpretation, as you can hear in the music from the opening sequence of Star Trek: The Next Generation, that begins with a fairly obvious parody of this opening, with the long held notes and a similar falling motif but with slightly different intervals. Notice that the horn and trumpet figures I just interrupted also seem to be inspired by Mahler, in this case by the first movement of the Seventh Symphony. Of course, Mahler himself may have been influenced by this remarkably similar mysterious passage from the finale of Brahms's Second Symphony, composed a little more than a decade earlier. Notice the similar orchestration, with the same motif also played by the winds, with the strings playing the long notes. As you should always expect from a Brahms symphony, these motifs are just rhythmically augmented fragments from the folksy opening theme. Perhaps Mahler also had in mind the mysterious slow introduction of Beethoven's Fourth Symphony, in which the long notes are played by the winds, while the strings play this similar configuration of falling thirds instead of fourths. The nature motif itself, like an arpeggio or a scale, is a common and natural pattern in tonal music generally, often appearing in the bass lines of Baroque music, like the famous or infamous repeating ground bass of Pachelbel's canon, but also appearing melodically, like in the Brahms we just heard, or like in this glorious moment at the end of the Cum Sancto Spiritu from Mozart's Mass in C minor, when it appears as a stretto of the inversion of the original fugal subject. Returning to Mahler, stay tuned for my video on this symphony's finale, in which this nature motif that opens the symphony becomes the triumphant march that ends the symphony. Back to this slow introduction of the first movement, after this initial clarinet fanfare, the woodwinds repeat the nature motif, again accompanied by this highest octave of string harmonics. This introduces a second fanfare played by the trumpets, far in the distance, meaning in most performances off stage. When I heard this fanfare as a child, I imagined the hero of this symphony and his army awakening at their camp off in the distance, though this probably wasn't the exact kind of hero Mahler had in mind. The strings now play the nature motif, but this time loudly interrupted by the clarinet also playing descending fourths, But, as Mahler writes in the score, imitating the call of a cuckoo with these very cuckoo-like articulations and dynamics. These 4 cuckoo calls introduce this horn passage that I always imagined as the sun rising, perhaps the reason this cuckoo is suddenly making noise, though notice on the prior page that some of his friends woke up before he did, maybe because of this trumpet fanfare. The trumpets interrupt this new horn melody with a 3rd fanfare, followed by more horn melody and a 4th fanfare, combined with 4 more cuckoos from the clarinet. Remember fanfare number 3. For when it returns at the most climactic moments of both this movement and the finale. Perhaps nostalgically, Mahler also quoted this important fanfare from his 1st symphony in his 9th symphony. Back to the 1st symphony, we left off at the first entrance of the timpani, paired with this ominous new chromatic cello and bass figure. I'm calling this the Brahms figure. Because it reminds me of the opening horn theme from his 2nd piano concerto. The Brahms figure now accompanies the return of the nature motif, played first by the muted 3rd horn, and then twice as quickly by 4 horns and the clarinet in imitation. The falling fourths now morph into cuckoo calls on the next page, and we finally understand their importance when they introduce the main theme of the exposition section, which itself begins with the cuckoo motif. The exposition section we're about to hear is one of Mahler's most consistently cheerful stretches of music, yet it's based on the second of his Songs of a Wayfarer, a quite depressing and likely autobiographical earlier song cycle about what else but unrequited love.
Ging heut Morgen übers Feld, Taumach auf den Gräsern hing, sprach zu mir der lustige Fink, ei du Welt.
Most of this song does sound lighthearted and naive, which makes sense given the text, since the singer is out enjoying nature and talking to the merry finch. But at the very end of the song, we discover its true message, that none of the beauties of nature can cheer him up because he's lost his love to another. In the First Symphony, we definitely will hear conflict and angst eventually, but for now, this entire exposition section really does just seem like a blissful morning nature walk. Notice that I'm numbering the important phrases from the song, since Mahler uses them much more contrapuntally in the symphony, as you can immediately see from this imitative bassoon entry. Fragments of the second phrase quickly modulate to the dominant key of A major, emphasized by some A major clarinet cuckoos, before the theme repeats in the new key, now with imitation of the second phrase as well. To explain the meaning of this new blue color, it's time for a tangent that I promise will eventually get to the point. This light green falling perfect fourth that we've now heard at the beginning of this theme as separate cuckoo calls and as the nature motif is actually the motivic glue that holds this whole symphony together, appearing prominently in every movement. For example, listen to this figure that opens the second movement, and the cuckoo calls that appear on the next page. The third movement also begins with falling fourths, now as a timpani ostinato, and of course, later in the movement we hear these klezmer cuckoos. Before I also show a passage from the finale, I should mention that composers for centuries had been incorporating birdsong, and even specifically the sound of a cuckoo, into their music. But the most famous example from a symphony is from Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony, at the end of its slow second movement, when the music is suddenly interrupted by 3 different birds that Beethoven even labeled in the score. First, the Nachtigall, or nightingale, played by the flute, then the Wachtel, or quail, played by the oboe, and finally the Kuckuck, or cuckoo, played by the clarinet. Notice that Beethoven uses the slightly more ornithologically correct interval of a major third instead of a perfect fourth. As part of my exhaustive research for this video, I listened to hundreds of actual cuckoo sounds on YouTube, and 99% of them range from a slightly flat minor third to a slightly sharp major third. Here's a representative example. Perhaps this Viennese music critic was onto something in 1900, when he sarcastically suggested that the cuckoo in Mahler's First Symphony that sings a provocatively abnormal descending fourth must have been some sort of Nietzschean super cuckoo, but he didn't have access to YouTube like I do. And I was finally able to find this actual super cuckoo that can sing nearly up to a perfect fifth. So maybe it was this super cuckoo's ancestors that Mahler grew up hearing. Back to Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony. Before we listen to this passage, let's also find out what the other two birds sound like in real life. First, here's the quail. Like the cuckoo, the quail is musically fairly straightforward, but the nightingale has a much more complex and varied song. Here's a fairly close example I found of a similar acceleration to a trill. Now that we know what these birds actually sound like, listen to this famous moment from Beethoven. Now back to Mahler. One of many instances of cuckoos from the finale is this moment that begins with the return of that second fanfare from the first movement, but now played by the clarinets. When the flutes join in, it starts to sound more like a large group of birds than a fanfare, and suddenly, in an obvious nod to Beethoven, we hear the same three birds from the Pastoral Symphony, though Mahler, who typically labels everything in his scores, leaves it up to us to recognize them. First, the quail played by the piccolo, then cuckoos played by multiple woodwinds, and then the trill of the nightingale played by the flute. I'll discuss this moment in context in my future video, but I obviously had to include it in my bird tangent for this video. Before moving on, I should mention that Beethoven himself may have gotten the idea for his passage from the famous Toy Symphony or Kindersymphonie from the 1760s, thought for more than a century to have been composed by Joseph Haydn, subsequently attributed to various other composers including Haydn's younger brother and Mozart's father, but currently thought to be of uncertain authorship. The symphony is scored for strings and various toy instruments, including whistles that sound like a cuckoo and a nightingale, in this case a cuckoo that sings a minor third. Listen to this first portion of the first movement, and in addition to the birds, notice the quirky 5-bar opening theme that reminds me of the opening theme from Mozart's A Musical Joke, since its first phrase elides or overlaps with its own repeat. So far, these are only 2 of Beethoven's 3 specific birds, but in the trio section of this symphony's much less famous second movement, we finally hear from the quail as well. the only children's books I currently have on my shelf is this one entitled Joseph Haydn, the Merry Little Peasant, copyright 1936, that narrates this hilarious and completely fictional origin story for the Toy Symphony. Maybe someday I'll do a dramatic reading for Patreon supporters, but for now, pause the video and enjoy reading it for yourself, noticing especially that, like many people, these authors didn't know about the quail in the second movement. For the record, many compositions even before the Toy Symphony imitated various birds, including these three, but I find it interesting that three well-known Austrian symphonies from different generations all quote the same combination of these three specific birds. Now finally back to Mahler, this whole tangent was meant to explain this new blue color that I used in the tangent to represent the nightingale. The second theme of this exposition section that we'll get to shortly is another obvious bird call. And since the nightingale's song is so varied, I decided to use its color for this theme, but fragments similar to this theme appear before the theme itself arrives, starting where we left off. So now we've finally solved the mystery of this new blue color. We now hear a third distinctive phrase from the original song, followed by more falling fourths and nightingale motifs. Notice also that this pizzicato cello accompaniment gives us a cuckoo in every bar, that I won't highlight unless other instruments emphasize them. More nightingale motifs and cuckoos, including these ones at the octave, now lead to another entrance of the opening phrase. We now hear a fourth song phrase that includes these folksy clarinet drones, a fifth song phrase that begins a crescendo, and two additional song phrases that continue this crescendo to the fortissimo entrance of the second theme I whistled earlier. Notice that this second theme is accompanied by these forceful, pulsating drone fifths, so our leisurely walk through nature has now suddenly become a rambunctious country dance. This is reminiscent of the country dance with a similar pulsating drone that suddenly breaks out in the third movement of Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony. Back to Mahler, you probably already noticed that this second theme is also accompanied by the original theme, played by the horns and strings, but then also by imitative entries of the inversion or upside-down mirror image of the second phrase. I always wonder whether Mahler got this idea from Brahms, who you'll remember in the first movement of his first symphony also accompanied the closing theme of the exposition section with the inversion of the opening theme. As you listen to the end of this Mahler exposition, notice also this slightly different new figure that I'm calling the yodeling figure, since whenever I hear it, I always think to myself, yodel-ee-oo. This section then intensifies even more to these statements of just the second theme, and then with these cuckoos dies away to the repeat of the exposition section. Before moving on to my favorite part of this movement, the development section, I have to point out, in yet another bird tangent, how obsessed Mahler himself was with cuckoos even before composing this symphony. I've already pointed out the most obvious quotation of a prior song, the second of the Songs of a Wayfarer, and most Mahler fans also know that this symphony's third movement extensively quotes the hauntingly beautiful fourth song of this cycle. But these are not the only songs from this cycle that are thematically linked to this symphony. Recall this flute solo we heard in the exposition. And compare with the opening bars of the first song in the cycle that alternate between nightingale and cuckoo. But this is just the tip of the cuckoo iceberg in Mahler's early songs. For example, in the song How to Make Naughty Children Behave, nearly every stanza from the text, for some reason, has cuckoos from the singer.
Es kam ein Herr zum Schlössli auf einem schönen Rösli. Da lugt die Frau zum Fenster aus.
In his more morbid song, The Changing of the Summer Guard, a cuckoo sings himself to death, and the opportunistic Frau Nachtigall swoops in to steal his job.
Kuckuck hat sich zu Tode gefallen an einer grünen Weide. Kuckuck ist tot, hat sich zu Tod gefallen.
You might have recognized this song since he used it later in his third symphony, in its third movement entitled What the Animals in the Forest Tell Me. And when orchestrated, these opening figures sound even more like bird calls. Since the song is about a cuckoo, it makes sense that the singer eventually sings these minor third cuckoos.
Kuckuck, wer soll uns denn den Sommer lang die Zeit und Weil vertreiben?
One of Mahler's most humorous Wunderhorn songs, In Praise of High Intellect, tells the story of a singing contest between, not surprisingly at this point, a cuckoo and a nightingale, who choose a donkey to be their judge because of his too large ears. Listen for this cascade of imitative cuckoos between the clarinets and bassoons that introduces the first line of text from the singer.
Einsmals in einem tiefen Tal, Kuckuck und Nachtigall täten ein Wett schlagen.
You might also recognize this song since he later reused its opening figure as part of this important contrapuntal subject in the finale of his Fifth Symphony. Back to the song, the nightingale sings first, and the donkey, confused by the nightingale's complex song, protests with a couple of hee-haws, represented musically by a falling minor 16th from the vocalist, and a falling minor 23rd from the E-flat clarinet, Mahler's favorite instrument for sarcastic or humorous moments like this. These are intervals so large that even a super cuckoo couldn't sing them.
Der Esel sprach, du machst mir's Chaos, du machst mir's Chaos. Ich kann's in Kopf nicht bringen.
Next, the cuckoo sings for the donkey, and notice that the text itself comments on what intervals were sung. And from this, we can deduce that, unfortunately for the nightingale, this is a super cuckoo. The donkey now declares the cuckoo to be the winner, and the song ends with the same cascade of cuckoos, but now with one final hee-haw. For more donkey-related Richard Atkinson content, please check out this old video about Haydn's Opus 76 No. 2 quartet, sometimes nicknamed The Donkey because of these similar enormous leaps in its finale. Back to Mahler, by the time he composed the spectacular third movement of his Fourth Symphony, the super cuckoo from these earlier compositions must have been far past its prime, since we now hear cuckoos at less than even the expected intervals, with the horn playing these major second cuckoos. And as I pointed out in this video 10 years ago, this may or may not have inspired the only other major second Austrian cuckoos I know of, from Rodgers and Hammerstein's The Sound of Music.
And up in the nursery an absurd little bird is popping up to say cuckoo, cuckoo, cuckoo. Regretfully they tell us, but firmly they compel us to say goodbye.
Finally back to where we left off in the First Symphony, the development section now begins by returning to the atmospheric stillness of the slow introduction, bringing back the high string harmonics. After the energetic country dance, it now seems like nighttime has returned, and I always imagine these harp downbeats to be those first few stars you see twinkling at dusk. The nightingale is still awake, as are the cuckoos, but now Mahler introduces a completely new theme that we'll hear throughout the rest of this movement and in the finale. It initially appears as fragments, first as these mysterious woodwind slurs and this downward cello glissando, then as slightly more of the theme from the cellos, answered by this much slower horn entry. The cellos now repeat this larger fragment, but now in minor, echoed by the oboe. This entire section, especially what we're about to hear, is like an unsettling dream with troubling premonitions of conflicts to come. This ominous feeling becomes even more evident at rehearsal 13, when the sustained A pedal tones we've heard throughout the introduction and development section so far continue but are suddenly joined by a harmonically confusing second pedal tone. This F natural played by the contrabasses and, in its first appearance in the symphony, the tuba. Also appearing for the first time, the bass drum adds to the mysterious but menacing nature of this moment. Mahler was such a meticulous orchestrator that he even sometimes addressed the possible inadequacies of performers in the score, like in this directive to have the contrabassoon play this important note if the tuba can't play it softly enough. Another example of this is the oboe solo that opens the second movement of the Third Symphony, where he writes that just for this portion in the oboe's lowest register, the English horn can be substituted if the oboist cannot perform the passage softly enough. Back to the First Symphony, these spooky double pedal tones a major third apart accompany more cuckoos and the new blue theme until the nature motif and the Brahms figure return from the slow introduction. The muted horns now introduce fragments of another new figure that will eventually become one of the most important ideas in the stormy finale, and we also hear its inversion played eerily by the harps. The clarinet cuckoos we just heard introduce one of the most magical moments of the symphony, the brilliant but subtle buildup of tension leading to rehearsal 15. It begins with a triple piano roll from the bass drum, and these sustained chords accompanying this increasingly energetic conversation between the clarinet cuckoo and the flute cuckoo, that to me signifies dawn approaching to end this strange dream. These are the only two instruments with crescendos, but the gradual increase in tension can already be felt in the prior bar, when these additional wind instruments add to the dissonant chord. And suddenly, the F natural we've been hearing this whole time in the bass shifts downward to create the same progression from French augmented sixth to tonic that you might remember from my video on the finale of Brahms's Fourth Symphony. And in the Mahler Symphony, we hear This enchanting return to D major introduces another completely new theme played by the horns that I'll highlight orange not because it resembles the orange horn melody from the introduction, but because in my mind they both signify the beginning of a new day. This theme is more fanfare-like than the earlier one, and could easily be mistaken for numerous moments in Wagner's Ring Cycle, especially with this tremolo violin accompaniment. Of course, the cuckoos interrupt one more time, and also notice that the horn theme itself ends with a few cuckoos of its own. Now that morning is again in full swing, the cheerful, leisurely mood of the exposition section returns, and the nightingale reappears and finally does that same type of acceleration to a trill we heard earlier in Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony, while the cellos, now for the first time, play the complete dark blue theme. The numbered green song phrases now return in many new combinations to interact with the nightingale motifs, the dark blue theme, and this new pink figure, visiting various distant keys, including B-flat minor in this fleeting moment of concern from the trumpet. Phrases 5, 6, and 7 now modulate from where I just interrupted in A-flat major, down a minor third to F major on the next page. This same modulation occurs in the original song just before the third stanza of text that talks about the gleaming sun and the world beginning to sparkle and gaining in tone and color. This corresponding F major section of the symphony has an almost trance-like soothing quality in this new key, but knowing where this is all leading, it reminds me of that balmy, humid weather that often precedes big storms, sometimes with abnormally vivid colors in the sky, like in that text from the song. The crescendo we just heard starts a much larger, turbulent, and menacing intensification to the largest climax of the movement, the triumphant beginning of the recapitulation section. This entire build-up, from where we left off at bar 304 until the climax, returns at the end of the final fourth movement relatively unchanged. I'll point out the small but important alterations in the future video, but for now, just notice the return of this purple motif that we barely got a glimpse of in the spooky dream sequence before, and now for the first time in the symphony, this turquoise motif that also will play a much larger role in the finale. Additionally, listen for this startling return of fanfare number 3 from the slow introduction, but now in D-flat major. You'll know when it's coming when you hear this single bass drum downbeat. We've arrived at the final and most intense portion of this build-up, when the new turquoise motif is reduced to these repetitive two-note fragments, accompanied by this repetitive bass line. At rehearsal 25, the intensity continues to increase as the bass line is played twice as quickly and the turquoise fragments are played twice as slowly. I always wonder whether this crescendo was inspired by Bruckner, whose symphonies contain numerous similar crescendos that use repetitive small fragments of the themes. For example, you might remember from this prior video the similarly supercharged crescendo from Bruckner's 6th Symphony, with these similar repetitive two-note fragments of the theme that occurs in the same location right before the recapitulation section of the first movement. Of course, remember that years before composing any symphonies, 17-year-old Gustav Mahler was one of only 25 Bruckner fanatics who remained in the audience at the disastrous premiere of Bruckner's 3rd Symphony, during which the rest of the audience and even some of the musicians reportedly walked out. Back to this Brucknerian crescendo. In its final 4 bars, the turquoise motif is reduced to a single long note, while the bass line is played even faster and rhythmically out of phase, while all 7 horns play these incredibly intense fanfare rhythms. All this turmoil is vanquished in a single percussive downbeat on the next page, with the trumpets again playing fanfare number 3 that we recently heard in the key of D-flat major, but now returning triumphantly in the tonic key of D major, reinforced by many other instruments. Though D major has finally returned, we don't feel completely resolved yet, due to the continuing dominant pedal point in the bass and in these woodwind trills. The satisfying, complete resolution occurs on the next page, with the return of the Wagnerian horn theme from earlier, but now played victoriously by the entire brass section to begin the recapitulation. Given the thematic density of this entire symphony, it's interesting that this Wagnerian orange brass theme appears only twice in the 2 most magical moments of this first movement, and this second time we only hear the first half, answered instead by these 3 upward flourishes heard mostly from the horns. We've heard a lot about birds and even a donkey so far in this video, but I'd like to add one final animal to the mix, since whenever I heard these 3 upward horn flourishes as a child, I always thought they sounded like the trumpeting of elephants, possibly because at this time in my childhood I was also frequently watching the Elephant Trumpeters from Disney's cartoon version of Robin Hood. Notice also on this page the triple forte nightingale trills from most of the woodwind section. As a child, I always imagined this page represented the hero's return to his kingdom after victory in battle. So maybe these piercing trills can represent the excitement of every nightingale in the entire realm. And of course, the cuckoos are also excited for the hero's return. The recapitulation brings back most of the thematic material from the exposition and development, but now in different contrapuntal combinations and in different orders. Although this movement's coda section really only consists of these final 10 bars, the entire recapitulation section has a racing breathlessness to it that makes the whole thing sound like a coda section. It reminds me of the quote I mentioned in this prior video from Brahms's friend, describing the coda of the third movement of his Fourth Symphony as one long-drawn breath. Back to where we left off, the pink motif from the development section returns, and its inverted fragments crescendo to the fortissimo reappearance of the first theme, leading to this strange fortissimo horn trill that perhaps sounds even more like actual elephants than the 3 flourishes we just heard. The breathlessness of the recapitulation section continues with an almost delirious cheerfulness, and although so far it's been markedly different from the exposition section, we finally return to the rambunctious country dance second theme, and from here on everything is relatively unchanged from the exposition, until the final cuckoos now accelerate to these 3 timpani cuckoos, followed by a dramatic pause. After all the heavy emotions we felt in this movement, it now ends with a flippant, humorous coda consisting of a call and answer between the winds and the timpani, with more dramatic rests before everyone joins in at the end. Mahler himself wrote that this coda represents his hero breaking out into laughter and running away, and it reminds me of the many comical joke endings by Haydn that I've discussed in numerous prior videos over the years. I'll now end this video by playing the final bars of this unique movement.